Yesterday we had gotten this far. We were talking about, this is in the section about euploidy, and now we were talking about something called aneuploidy. And aneuploidy means that the organism is either lacking some chromosomes or they have some extra chromosomes. In other words, they don't have just the normal 2N. They're either 2N with minus something or 2N plus something. They have little extra chromosomes. And this is the process by which this happens, where you don't end up with everything having the normal set, is a process that's called non-disjunction. And when a chromosome, and what non-disjunction is when the chromosomes, remember, they line up at the center during metaphase, right, of meiosis. This has to happen during meiosis because this is going to affect the organism as a whole. When it lines up in the center and we get to the second metaphase, the second meiosis, in other words, the pair of chromosomes should one go to one sex cell, the other one go to the opposite sex cell. But what's happening here, they don't separate properly. So of this one chromosome pair, there are other chromosome pairs, but there's this one chromosome pair, instead of one going this way and one going this way, which we ordinarily would think would happen, in this situation, both of them are going one way and none of those pair are going this way. So this one's going to have an extra chromosome. This one over here is going to be short a chromosome. Follow that? So when they normally separate, two of them are going the same way instead of going opposite ways. Two are going this way, and there's nothing going over here. So they're going to be, this sex cell over here is going to be short a chromosome. This one over here is going to have an extra chromosome of just, not of every chromosome in the set, but just of that chromosome pair. Okay? So we're going to, as I said, we're trying to get haploid, right, in the sex cells. In other words, just one of every pair. But we're getting one with an extra one, and we're also getting one with a shortage of one. Now, that type of thing causes these types of, in plants it's kind of normal, but in humans, that actually can cause some of the different syndromes that you've heard about, like Down syndrome, for instance, is one of those. So here's the one where they're actually short. This particular chromosome doesn't have its homologue. This one has an extra one. Now, how does that affect the organism? How does it affect it? Well, if you have an extra one, in other words, if you received a sex cell that had this extra chromosome and it combined with another normal sex cell, you're going to have this kind of thing going on right here. And an example of this is like Down syndrome. There are others that are listed in your book, different syndromes that you can have. The Down syndrome has one extra one, and the one they have extra is chromosome number 21. Okay, if you remember, you arrange them from largest to smallest on that scale. This is one of the smaller chromosomes, but they happen to have 3 of it instead of the ordinary 2. And you can then, what you know about Down syndrome are the possible characteristics that this individual have. They often have like a thicker tongue. They have maybe a little bit thicker neck. Their eyes tend to be a little more slanted, like that, not a great amount, just a little bit more. The range in their mental ability can be quite varied with someone like that. Some of them, I think we talked about this yesterday, where some of them can actually be capable of living on their own, maybe in a group house or something like that, as adults. Some of them maybe have to, live with their parents their entire lifetime. They usually don't live, to the normal life expectancy that you would, most humans have. But right now, males have life expectancy kind of in the middle to upper 70s, and women closer to 80 is, like what we call normal life expectancy in the U.S. Not worldwide, obviously. Now, if you have one where they're lacking one of these, so we only have one of those, and what's the prefix for one? There's a couple prefixes we use for one. What are they? What do we call a one-wheel cycle? Unicycle, right? You ever heard of that? Well, there's another meaning for one, means mono. And so that's why we call this monosomy. They only have one instead of the normal 2 chromosomes. And an example of this would be like this right here. She has Turner syndrome. In Turner syndrome, they're typically shorter in stature. They're not as tall. So in other words, this somehow affects height. Their ears are a little bit different in shape. The female sex organs don't, like the ovaries don't develop normally or properly. So there's a bunch of things that are result of missing one chromosome. So everything that's on the chromosome that is there is going to show up, right? There's nothing on the other chromosome, which is not there, to mask it. So whatever's on that other chromosome is going to be exhibited, those characteristics. Those genes are going to be have the potential of exhibiting their characteristic. So they're short one chromosome. So Turner syndrome is short one, Down syndrome has an extra one. And there are other syndromes like that where we figured out, what's different than usual. I hate to say normal. I mean, that's our idea of normal, not necessarily God's idea of normal. A person with Down syndrome is made in God's image just like everyone else here. It's just they have a different, a different set of genes that they're working with, And this isn't the only body you'll ever have, thank goodness. We'll all get a new body if we are believers, and we're going to get a new body, and the Bible really doesn't say what it'll be like. If I were to guess, and then this is just a guess on my part, we might get a body sort of like what God gave to Adam and Eve, right? They were probably adult, not necessarily old age adult, they're probably a young adult. I'm kind of guessing that's maybe we'll be. Question is, will we have scars in heaven? I don't think so. I agree with you. I don't think we'll have scars in heaven. There'll be something different about us that we actually learn how to recognize one another by. Remember that when Jesus went on the mountain with Peter, James, and John, and Moses and was it Elijah, I think, show up. They'd never seen Moses and Elijah. They knew exactly who they were. So there's something about them that made them recognizable. And I think that's the way we will be in heaven. There will be only one person in heaven with scars, right? Who's that? Jesus. Yeah, Jesus is the only one who will be in heaven with scars. Doesn't seem fair, does it? But it will remind us. Okay, now, where does, in this discussion right here, how do we get a mule? Does anybody know how we get mules? You cross a horse and a donkey, and the horse needs to be a female, and the donkey needs to be a male. There is I forget what they call it if it's the other combination. It's not a mule. It still has, horse or mule, donkey like characteristics, but the mule typically is big like a horse. Has longer ears like the donkey. Very sturdy animal. They were used a lot to, as work animals or pack animals. I remember my dad during World War II worked up in the mountains building flood control dams and stuff like that. And they used mules. And why? Because they could carry so much. They were just really sturdy animals. But what happens there is the horse has 32, their end number, let's say that was 32, and the donkey's is 31. But what happens is we end up with, we add those two together, the horse's 2 end number would be 64, the donkey's 2 end number would be 32, but they end up with one in between. 63. So, there's one side only has 31, the other side has 32, so that's how we get the 63. But the interesting thing about a mule is most mules are sterile. They're incapable of reproducing themselves. You can't cross a mule with a mule and get more mules. You can only get another mule if you cross another female horse and a male donkey. So now that kind of finishes up that section. Next we want to talk about mutations. And any change in the DNA of an organism is called a mutation. So any change. So it's a pretty broad term for mutation. Mutations can be lethal, but they're not necessarily guaranteed to be lethal. There are some mutations that if you have that mutation, it will either prevent it from ever being born or hatched or whatever, however this organism comes about, or it might be, still be able to survive, but maybe have some something that doesn't make it like the average population, like what we would consider normal. Now, how can these mutations occur? Well, one of the ways is we can look at what happens to the chromosome. And one of the ways that that happens actually quite often, it's not considered a mutation, but it is a change in the chromosome. It is a change in the chromosome. And while these chromosomes line up in the middle, during metaphase, well, they're, the ends kind of stick out, and they can touch another one where, so they're actually like crossing over. And what can happen as they cross over is the end of this one will stuck on the green one, and the green end will get stuck on the red one. Okay? And this is something they say actually does happen fairly regularly. Not all the time, but it's not uncommon for that to happen. So it's not a mutation, but it's an exchange of information between a homologous pair. Okay? Remember, in a homologous pair, they have all the same genes genes for the same characteristics from top to bottom. You're just switching them from one homolog to the other homolog. All they're different. So if you think about that, if that's what happens when, in the formation of eggs and sperm, in that process, that's going to cause a lot more variety in the sperm and egg, and it's going to cause more variety in the way, for instance, like the children will look. Ordinarily we would think, well, if they have this characteristic, then they automatically have this. Well, not necessarily, if they cross over in the right way. Like, for instance, we ordinarily think of people with blonde hair often have what color eyes to go with it? Blue eyes. But how far the genes are apart, it could be that if you have crossing over taking place like right here, it could be that the gene, let's say for blonde hair is here, but the gene for blue eye is down here, and now it's on a different chromosome. So you might have people with blonde hair and brown eyes, or green eyes, or eye color is actually caused by a number of different pairs of genes. We call it polygenic, that Jake learned a lot about the other night, didn't you? So this is kind of like genetic recombination, and it makes for a lot more variety. So not everybody, not all the kids look alike, Another kind of change within a chromosome is what we call translocation. Translocation, and this doesn't happen between homologs, in other words, two chromosomes of the same pair, but between one chromosome of one pair and another chromosome of a different pair. And as you can see up here, we have two different pairs here, and these happen to be lapping over the other, and they trade tips. So this one has the green end, and this one has, notice that this one's at the top and now this one's at the bottom. Because, one was at the bottom, let's say bottom of one chromosome, one was at the top of the other chromosome, so one has a different top than it originally had, the other one has a different bottom than it originally had. And that is also just going to be, now what we'll call, now the gene is not on the same chromosome as, or the same pair, it's part of a different pair. So that's could create some differences in the way the offspring look like. Okay, so now another way that can happen is called deletion. This is where something caused a piece of the chromosome to break off, and in the process of them forming the two sexuals, remember the two chromosomes go to opposite ends, this is not attached to one of the chromosomes, and so doesn't follow to the end where it belongs. Now, ordinarily, broken off pieces will reattach, but sometimes they don't, and when they don't, after they've moved to opposite ends of the cell and the nuclear membrane reforms around the chromosomes that are there, this might end up being on the outside of the nuclear membrane, not in the inside where it belongs, and so it will just end up disintegrating. So now we have a chromosome that's missing genes for certain characteristics. So this gene now is shorter than its homolog, and it's missing some of the, so there's nothing over here to mask whatever was over there, if it could mask. So that's not necessarily a good thing. It results in offspring that lack certain genes. So there are some characteristics that are caused because you don't have the genes to produce the proteins that you need to be able to make certain structures. This person right here is the picture that you have in your textbook. She has something called Cri du Chat, is a name that we have chosen. I think they discovered probably with a name like that, sounds like it's French, right? And but it means the cry of a cat. So in other words, their vocal cords or their voice box isn't formed normally, and so when they make a sound, it sounds like a cat cry instead of the way we talk. So that's because some genes are missing to produce the proteins that they need to make the complete structure. Still another kind of chromosome change is called inversion. So inversion means what? If something's inverted, it means what? What?
You change it you can invert feet, I think inches or something like that.
Well, that's convert.
Oh, close.
Invert, what does it mean if an airplane flies inverted? What does that mean? Flipped over, right? Flies upside down. So this means flipped over. So what happens here is, remember I said that sometimes chromosomes can break, but they usually reattach? Well, in this case, they got flipped around before they reattached, and so the ends are, this had C above D and then E. Now with it flipped over, we're going to have D, then C, then E. Now, as long as it breaks in between genes, that's no problem. You still have the same genes, still have the same letters that make up those genes. And so it usually doesn't cause a serious disorder of any kind. You still have the genes, it's just not in the same order on homologous chromosomes. Okay, so that finishes our discussion of all the different ways that a chromosome can get changed. Ordinarily, this doesn't happen much other than maybe, like I said, like the crossing over probably does happen on a more regular basis. Not all the time, but more regularly. The others are kind of things that don't always happen. They could be produced maybe more often with certain, if the cells are exposed to certain chemicals or certain radiation and stuff like that. Now, we're going to talk about the gene. Now, we're not talking about the whole chromosome, but just the gene on it. And we have what we call gene mutation, where we're actually altering the gene. Now, the gene is made up of how many letters? 3 letters, right? And they were the letters C, G, A, and T, right? Okay, now, what we're saying here is we're altering that in some way. And we could, maybe it still has all 3 letters, but one of the letters was changed. This is a gene involving just one of those letters being changed. We call that a point mutation, where instead of an A, now it has maybe like a T or a G or one of those other letters is in there. So it still has 3 letters, like ordinary. It didn't change anything about the genes that are nearby. It just has a different set of letters. Now, I don't know if you looked at that chart that you had in a previous chapter about what gene combination or base combinations would produce or code for different amino acids. If you noticed on that chart, there were some amino acids that actually there can be several different letter combinations that still code for exactly the same amino acid. Now, my guess is God made it that way so that if there is a mutation, this amino acid is still going to be coded for because it's really important, to make this particular protein. Anything messing up here is going to be really serious, and so God just gave some of these amino acids multiple codes. There are some of the amino acids that only have one single code, so maybe it's not as important, that they're less likely to be changed or anything like that. So these point mutations, you're just taking one of the nucleotides or the bases, whatever you want to call them, and you are changing just one of those. And it seems to be a very insignificant change, but it is potentially profound. It could totally code for an entirely different amino acid in that protein. So the protein's going to be different than it was before. It may not function like it's supposed to. Maybe not the right shape or whatever it is it needs to be. So, how can this gene be changed? Well, one is, I've already kind of hinted at, is substitution. There could be just one of these letters that's different than it was before. Something caused one nucleotide to be replaced with another one. Maybe in the transcription process or something like that could be when that might happen. Another way is, what if an extra nucleotide gets added? So we have, remember, the genes are in groups of 3, And if I add a letter in there, what will happen to the words? The next three won't be the same word as it was before, right? Because if I'm going in by groups of three, it will make it off by one. So everything from there to like let's say the end of the chromosome is going to be off. It'll be different codes, different words than they were before. Deletion, what if one of the nucleotides got cut out? Well, then all the words after that would be off too, wouldn't they? If I'm always going by threes, I'd have different words, different genes. So what are the possible effects on this? Well, with substitution, it could be pretty serious. It could be a major effect. It could be coding for an entirely different protein. Amino acid, I'm sorry. Entirely different amino acid. It could be rather minor. Maybe it makes a slightly different protein, but maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe it's not enough to affect the organism's health. And maybe has no effect at all, because it just codes for the same amino acid it did before, just a different name for it. So when you add or subtract a nucleotide, it alters the word order, right? And we call that frame shift. So everything now, if I take a letter out and I always go by threes, then I'll have a new word than I had before. So we call that a frame shift. And so these codons are just kind of have been rearranged. Now I'm coding, the gene's actually coding for a different amino acid. Or maybe, one of the things, some of those codes were actually for start and stop. What if it coded for a stop when it wasn't time to stop yet? So that means the protein is going to be incomplete. Or what if it codes for a start? Okay, it's going to start something, start building a protein, but it's missing all the first part, or something like that. So these mutations can, have effects all the way from really doesn't change anything to can be really serious, where that mutation could, if an organism has that, in developing, it may just stop its development and be like in humans could be like a miscarriage, or an egg that's hatching out only goes so far and it just dies. You've probably seen some eggs in nests that, just never did develop into a little chick or whatever, Now, some mutations happen naturally. And I've read that we can have as many as, in the course of our lifetime, 30 mutations in our body at any one time that are new to our body, that we weren't given to us by our parents. Remember, the genetic code that we got in the sperm and egg from each parent could be carrying some mutations. It could be. They are carrying some mutations. And each generation's adding a little bit more to them. Now, the chemicals, or the things, I should say, that cause a mutation to occur, we call them mutagens. If they're chemicals, we often refer to those as being carcinogens. Ever heard that word, carcinogens? Cancer-causing agents. Like we know, for instance, that nicotine is a carcinogen. People who smoke increase the risk of developing a cancer, right, from that. So that's a cell has been somehow altered so that it becomes cancerous. Or being exposed to certain chemicals like for instance, if you have acid reflux disease, that means stomach acid is constantly going up in your esophagus, and the cells at the bottom end of your esophagus are constantly being exposed to this acid environment. And it can slowly alter the cells genetically so that they can become first precancerous, and then if you don't do any treatment to that, can actually become cancerous. And so then you'll have esophageal cancer, cancer of your esophagus. When I was, how many years ago? That'd be almost 20 years ago. So when I was probably around 50, I went in for some tests. We had a friend who was a gastroenterologist. My wife was working for him, and she just thought, let's take advantage of him and have some tests. And I found out that I had, it's called Barrett's disease. And Barrett's disease means that the cells in the lower esophagus were tending toward the direction of cancer. Now, I've taken certain pills since then, and through multiple testings have found out that my esophagus has now gone back to normal. Also, I don't have the acid reflux that I had before. It kind of works on both ends. Converts the cells back to the way they're supposed to be, and keeps me from having acid reflux, where acid comes out of your stomach up into your esophagus. Like having heartburn quite often. We've all probably had heartburn at once in a while, but this is something that's kind of a regular thing that you might have if you have acid reflux. So chemicals can cause that. Radiation can cause that. We know, for instance, that exposure to ultraviolet light on your skin enough can cause what? Skin cancer. So people who live where they are exposed to a lot of sun will, part of their getting ready in the morning is to put on sunscreen before, like women before they put any makeup on or something like that. Guys put it on before they go outside, because we know that exposure to sun, which is the ultraviolet radiation, is what's going to cause these cells to become cancerous. I had two of my friends, while I lived in Phoenix over that 12 years, one of them had to have cancer cells removed from his head twice. One of them had it on his lip and on his ear. They literally had to cut a chunk out of his ear and then stitch the ends together. It's amazing, though, that at first it looks weird, to have that chunk and kind of puckered back together, but it's with time, his ear went back to looking pretty normal. He didn't even notice that he had missed it. Or same thing they'd have to cut a chunk out of his lip and then stitch it back together. And at first it looked, weird, but after a while it became all normal, and I was kind of surprised. Another one had a big area on his forehead, because he was bald. Well, both these guys are bald, but had it on his forehead where they had to take a whole big patch of skin off and sometimes they have to do grafts. So those would be mutagens. Sun can be a mutagen. Now, when it comes to what are the biological effects of a mutation, if it's a mutation in a cell that doesn't become a sex cell, then it's just limited to that cell and any cells that come from that. So you might have, I think it shows in your book, you might have a mole, for instance, that is a mutation, and usually, if you have a little mole, it just stays that size probably, almost all your life. There are some famous people who, have moles, and they purposely don't want to have it taken off because everybody identifies them by this cute little mole that they maybe have on their face or something like that. I think there's a picture of somebody in your textbook that has a mole on their face, and it looks pretty normal to us. Now, it's only when that mole starts getting larger and becoming irregular in shape and puffy, that's a concern, because then maybe has gone from being just a mole to becoming cancerous, and they'll probably want to have it removed. So if it happens in a cell that's not what we call a germ cell, a cell that's going to become a gamete, those you don't pass on to your offspring. You have it. So if you get cancer, typically it's always in those cells, and you don't pass your cancer off to your offspring. Okay? If you have any children after you've had cancer, they won't necessarily have cancer. Now, it could be that you have genes that make it more likely that you will develop a certain cancer, that, like, we know that there's certain genes that some women can have that what causes them to have breast cancer. And so they will often, when mom has it and one of the sisters already has cancer of the same kind, they often will do testing of the remaining sisters to find out, do they have that same gene or not? And then they'll have to decide what are they going to do if they have that gene. So most mutations have no effect because they're in the somatic cells, not the sex cells. So every cell that's not a sex cell is called a somatic cell. And we're multicellular organisms, so if it happens in one cell, it's only going to affect that area. But moles are an example of a benign mutation. You can also have some tumors that are like that, and they're benign, which means they're not cancerous. It may grow and be a problem, and you'll have to have it removed. Several years ago, some of you remember Miss Berg had a brain tumor and had most of it removed, and then they used some treatment to shrink the part that's left. But hers wasn't cancerous. Whereas on the other hand, Miss Nyland had a cancerous brain tumor, and they couldn't remove enough of it, and they couldn't treat it all, and it ended up taking her life. She passed away here, 2 weeks ago? So, mutations may or may not be bad, I guess is the way I would say it. A germ mutation, though, is a mutation that happens in the sex-forming cells. The cells that form sex cells, that will get passed on to the offspring. That's not a good thing. In other words, and you won't know about that you have passed it on, because it's not happening in the somatic cells, the part, the rest of your body. It's just in this sex cell, or the cells that are going to produce sex cells, and they get passed off to offspring. I mean, if you have no children after that, it goes nowhere. It's only if it's passed off to children. So this, though, is not like a somatic that only affects that cell and any cells that come from it. Every part of the new organism comes from that cell. So every cell will have that mutation. Absolutely every one of them will have that mutation. And be part of the next germ cells that will make sex cells for the next generation and get passed on, with every succeeding generation. So what genes do is to be expressed, they have to be activated. Not every gene in your body is active at all times. Some need to be turned on. You had some of your genes turned on as you developed from an embryo to a fetus to an infant to an adult. Okay, you have some of them that are turned on. And then once you become an adult, these genes get turned off. They don't need to be turned on anymore. And so, for instance, we have genes, like, let's say, the genes that are responsible for growing, let's say, a finger. Well, okay, we'll stop right here.